All right, so I'm going to finish this series by taking a look specifically at Isaiah Berlin's particular version of liberalism. It's not pure liberalism. In fact, in some ways I see a lot of different elements at work in Berlin's point of view, including a little bit of classical conservatism. So in what we've covered, we've learned that Berlin was uncomfortable with universalism because he thought that it didn't reflect the reality of the human condition, in which people vary a great deal from culture to culture, place to place, time to time. And universal philosophies try to more or less cram all that diversity into a one-size-fits-all position, which then leads to trying to force people into that position. You could say this certainly of totalitarian communism, but also to a great extent the position of countries like the United States, that basically all countries could benefit from liberal democracy. But Berlin was also troubled by relativism, and he didn't want to be identified as a relativist, even though he was often accused of being a relativist by critics. He thought that he had established a way between universalism and relativism, and therefore a way of avoiding the dangers of both, because, of course, relativism brings about the moral dangers of just accepting anything that people do without any ability to criticize that because it's their choice and their morality. He wanted to find another way. So let's take a look at that and see if he actually did. I prefer coffee. You prefer champagne. We have different tastes. There is no more to be said. That, he says, is relativism. But Herder's view and Vico's is not that. It is what I should describe as pluralism. That is, the conception that there are many different ends that men may seek and still be fully rational. Well, we know that he agreed with Vico on that men could have many different ends or goals and seek them truly and still be fully rational, but never reach agreement with each other on what was the most important end or goal. So Berlin's liberalism begins with an acknowledgement or a concession that it admits the disastrous results of universalistic philosophies. And he makes the interesting point that universalistic tendencies go way back in the Western viewpoint. He refers to the monism of earlier eras, or the worship of oneness, and he references Judaism, Platonism, and Christianity in this regard. So, in other words, Berlin would deny that the dream of a universal theory that encompassed all only began in the Enlightenment. This is a tendency that goes way back and that really starts with Judeo-Christianity on the one hand and Plato on the other. Jerusalem and Athens, as Hannah Arendt would say. So he starts out with that concession, and that is a major concession. It's basically a big critique of liberalism, right? That most often liberalism reflects this tendency towards monism, towards forcing people to go along with a particular liberal view. It doesn't allow for diversity or for pluralism. So he says that. He also makes a point of saying, so he concedes that place matters, that is where you are born, and the time that you're born, of course. He says common languages and ways should and do unite people. But he also points out, and of course he's writing this in the wake of the disastrous 20th century, the development of fascism and Nazism in particular. He's writing this in the wake of all of that, and he makes the point that race is not a necessary or even desirable limiter. So this shows one place of limit for Berlin. Basically, he's not willing to go there, that racial and ethnic differences can or should unite people, because that's been proven to be too dangerous. Now, whether you can just say that and make it go away, well, that's, obviously no. But he then moves to establish what I call a thin common humanity. For instance, he says in Chapter 2 of Crooked Timber of Humanity, all men seek food and drink, shelter and security. All men want to procreate. All men seek social intercourse, justice, a degree of liberty, means of self-expression and the like. The means towards these ends may differ from country to country and age to age, but the ends, whether alterable in principle or not, remain unaltered. I call this a thin common humanity because you'll notice that it's very, very basic, and even when he mentions things like justice and liberty, he doesn't define those things. He doesn't lend specificity enough that you couldn't see liberty in very different ways depending on what culture you were in, for instance. And that's on purpose. We do have this common human nature that underlies a great deal of diversity, but it's very, very basic. We're social creatures, he admits that. We have some claims on justice, but we define justice very differently depending on where we live. But Berlin thinks that this thin humanity sets up the ability to negotiate and compromise to preserve the common good. And that's because it's enough for us to be able to imagine ourselves into the minds of other people who are very different from ourselves. He's very adamant about this. The way that we can relate to others despite value diversity is through imagining through our commonalities into the perspective of others. And this is what is necessary to find compromise in Berlin's view. This is basically empathy. I don't believe he uses that word, but that's how we can relate to it for sure. Empathy means being able to put yourself through your imagination into somebody else's shoes. And in fact, he's so emphatic about this as a requirement and something that people can do, that he says that if we cannot do this, we are not quite human. And we do not have to try to tolerate the person who cannot do this. I think that's a pretty strong statement. In fact, I believe he does use the term sociopath in one spot in this book. The sociopath doesn't have a sense of empathy. They can't imagine themselves into somebody else's life, and this is why they often have a lot of trouble with self-control and with dealing with other people or treating other people as human beings. Berlin identifies this mentality as universally unacceptable, and so he sets a standard there. People do not have to try to compromise or tolerate the sociopathic person. I would assume the sociopathic leader like Hitler, the sociopathic movement, could be seen as an absolute threat. I don't have any doubt that Berlin did see it as such. You see, he's saying we can have this kind of bottom line where we can actually say, no, this mentality is absolutely wrong, and still preserve a respect for the great deal of acceptable and understandable, because human, diversity of morality, interests, goals. I found a paragraph in Crooked Timber, I believe this is from chapter 1, but it might be 2, that really sums up his liberalism well. He says, perhaps the best that one can do is to try to promote some kind of equilibrium, necessarily unstable, between the different aspirations of differing groups of human beings, at the very least to prevent them from attempting to exterminate each other, and so far as possible to prevent them from hurting each other, and to promote the maximum practical degree of sympathy and understanding never likely to be complete between them. So this for him is the proper liberal position. So this would involve contact with those whose ways of life are very different, not with the aim of converting and not even with the aim of being totally okay and comfortable, but with the aim of getting to know each other's perspectives well enough that they can deal with each other. And he acknowledges that this equilibrium, if it exists, is always going to be unstable, It is never going to be complete. That, in his view, is the human condition. And this is why it's tragic. The human condition is tragic because ultimately the best we can do is kind of muddle through and hope that we can promote compromise and avoid, as he puts it here, extermination, avoid violence. At best, we get sympathy and understanding. But if not that, at least compromising. And this is from that same paragraph. He says, but this is not, on its face, a wildly exciting program. A liberal sermon which recommends machinery designed to prevent people from doing each other too much harm, giving each human group sufficient room to realize its own idiosyncratic, unique, particular ends without too much interference with the ends of others, is not a passionate battle cry to inspire men to sacrifice and martyrdom and heroic feats. Yet if it were adopted, it might yet prevent mutual destruction and in the end preserve the world. So in the end, this is a kind of conservative liberalism. It's the type of liberalism that's realistic about what human beings can achieve and the possibility of unity. That is to say, there is no possibility of unity. It's conservative in the classical sense because it's very respectful of other ways of life and is willing to let them be and live their own way out of respect for the fact that it works for them. But that doesn't go all the way because he's also saying there are some bottom line values that cannot be changed. And probably the biggest, most emphatic one is this value against the sociopathic person and motivation. But also he places such a heavy emphasis on these basic means of life like food and shelter, social intercourse, a degree of liberty. These things, I suspect, if they were being trampled upon or people were deprived of basic needs, I suspect that Berlin would support humanitarian action in order to alleviate suffering caused by threats to these very basic things. But a twist would be in the case of, for instance, social intercourse, justice, degree of liberty, and those kinds of interpretable values. I think Berlin would probably say you need to respect the society's definition of what those things mean, and only then, if those things are under threat as they conceive them, would there be any sort of justification for intervention. I'm speculating about intervention because I think that any liberal scheme creates a door to intervention because there is a bottom line humanity, in this case a very thin common humanity, creates the claim, the potential claim of intervention. Berlin, it probably falls into that category. When the door is open a bit, it opens wider to people who want to interpret it more broadly, right? So that it can quickly become we need to bring communism, or we need to bring democracy or capitalism to other people. So where Berlin is very useful to us is you see him struggling mightily to find that line, to draw that line so that we can say, yes, there's enough common humanity that we should not totally disregard each other's well-being, and we can compromise, but not so much common humanity that we decide that we can have some sort of universalistic world system that warrants a great deal of violence. So this is basically Berlin's attempt. I would recommend reading one or the other of these two books, either The Crooked Timber of Humanity or Against the Current. And I drew mainly from The Crooked Timber of Humanity. So I guess I would recommend that more highly because I found it easier to draw big ideas out of that book. But they're both very good, and I encourage you to read a little bit of Berlin. At some point, you'll get a lot out of it. All right, bye.